Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Brownfields Grant Writing Training webinar series. It's never too early to start. And boy, isn't that the truth. Next slide, please. I am your host for today. I'm Sabine Martin. I am not Jennifer Clancy, who originally was supposed to run this webinar. Jennifer had a family emergency. She just found out about that half hour ago. So you get me today. I was just supposed to be a speaker on this, but we'll manage. But if things are a little bit rough in places, just I apologize in advance. Hopefully everything will go just fine. I am a TAB partner, a K-State partner. I am also I'm the K-State TAB contact for Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. And I'm the president and owner of Citrus Solutions. This is the third webinar of the series, and today we're talking about the very first section of the Brownfields Grant narrative, which is project area description and plans for revitalization. We have divided this webinar into sections that align with the subsections of the grant guidance. So if you have the guidance in front of you from last year, obviously this is the guidance that we're using. You can follow along that way too. So just a very quick overview how things will go today. I'll start off with a few housekeeping things, and then we'll jump right into the first subsection, which is target area and brownfields, target area description and brownfields, actually. And during this part, you'll hear from me and from Danielle Getzinger with Community Lattice. And then we'll have a few brief panel discussions sprinkled in. One will be after this subsections. With myself and Michelle Sponheimer from the city of Marshalltown, Iowa, and Danielle Getzinger. And then we'll move into the second subsections, the next one under this big header, which is revitalization of the target area. And here you'll hear again from Michelle and from myself, and you'll also hear from Brenda Dix, who is with ICF. Then finally, we move into the final subsections for this part of the grant guidelines, which is strategies for leveraging resources, and Al will be the one handling that subsection. We'll take about 5 minutes in between each of these subsections for Q&A, answer some of the questions that you may have, and provide some clarification. And then at the very end, we'll do another Q&A and wrap up, and that's where we'll ask you also to fill out the evaluations for this webinar series, and then we'll close things out. Next slide, please. So what's a webinar without ground rules, right? So here are ours, not very many, but if you experience technical difficulties, please dial the number on the screen here on the slide, or use that email. Obviously, dialing the number is a little bit faster than just emailing per chance. Also, we're recording this webinar today, and it will be available on the KSU TAB website where you registered for this event, as well as on the web page that was developed for this entire series, the grant writing webinar series. Both links will be shared by Dana in the chat box. Next slide, please. I'm sure we're all very accustomed by now with Zoom etiquette because of COVID over the last year when everything was just online. But just a refresher here, a reminder to make sure that everybody has a good experience. All participants should please be muted throughout the webinar. So double check, please, that your microphone is on mute now and throughout the entire webinar. Please make sure your video remains off during the presentation. To make sure we're able to verify your attendance, please change your participant name to match the name you used to register. And if anybody is calling in using the phone, if you could please put your name and your phone number in the chat so we can add you to the registration list, that would be great. If you do need to change your name for this webinar, on the little icon by your name, by your picture or by your name, you can do this by clicking on the participants icon on the Zoom toolbar. And when that list of participants comes up, please locate yourself, click on the More button, and then select Rename. It's as simple as that. And then a new box will appear asking you to enter a new screen name. Finally, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the event today, of course. Please do so by using the chat feature, and also, which is also located in the Zoom toolbar on the bottom of your screen. At least it's on the bottom of mine here. And we would prefer that questions be sent to everybody. But if you're not comfortable doing so, or if you have a question that really is only for that one speaker, you may do so and just contact that one speaker in the chat function. But just be aware that whoever speaks, whoever gives the presentation, usually cannot see the chat box. So it might be a little bit later once your question gets answered. Next slide, please. All right, so this whole webinar is, as I said, about the first big subsection or the first big section of the grant, which is project area description and plans for revitalization. Next slide, please. So the first subsection under this big umbrella is target area and brownfields. So here you will be asked to give an overview of brownfields challenges and descriptions of your selected target area, and then also describe your priority site, your priority sites, plural, that you selected to write this grant application for. Next slide. So this is from the guidelines. This is the overview of brownfields challenges and description of target area. What you see on this screen is how it reads in the RFP. The first two bullets, and then the last one is the evaluation criteria. So whenever you write, and that goes throughout the entire brownfields grant application, make sure you compare what you write to the evaluation criteria so you don't lose any points and you don't miss anything. So for this particular subsection, you need to identify the geographic boundary or boundaries where you are proposing to conduct site activities under this grant, and you need to discuss the brownfield challenges and their impacts. Within the geographic boundaries discussed above, you need to identify and describe the specific target areas that you settled on, basically where you focus your grant activities, such as a neighborhood, a district, a corridor, a census tract, maybe even I don't know, maybe a county. So kind of depends on the scope and the design of your project, but you need to lay this out. And then here under the third bullet on the slide, you see how whatever you write will be evaluated by EPA, by the reviewers. So the section is evaluated on the extent to which, and then we have all these 4 bullets there. Geographic boundaries are identified. Everything is clear and concise. So just make sure, again, throughout the entire application that you don't ramble, just be clear, concise with everything you do in this. Brownfield challenges are clearly discussed to the degree to which the challenges impact the area in the geographic boundaries, and the grant will potentially help address those challenges and impacts. So what are your challenges? How will you address them? And if you bring that across clearly, you should be good to go. And of course, you need to describe the specific target areas. I mean, why are there these challenges that you hope to address with this grant? Next slide, please. All right, so now we hear from Danielle Getzinger with Community Lattice, and she's going to talk a little bit about the selection of target areas, how they did that in the area that she lives in, right? Still.
Hi, everybody. Danielle Getzinger with Community Lattice, KSU TAB partner, and happy to walk you through the selection of target areas, as well as the description of those target areas. This is a photo from the city of Austin and the way that we use data to really target those areas. And I know that next week we'll be doing a segment on EJ Screen and some of the data tools. So we can table that for then, but that's kind of how we use it. Next slide. So first, I wanted to just point out that there are 2 areas that the grant calls for. One is the geographic area and then the target area. So this is actually a really great visual of what the difference is between the two. And this is with the city of Houston and a grant that we wrote a couple of years ago for the greater Fifth Ward community target area. That geographic area, that larger area would be the city of Houston itself. So if you're in a town, if you are in a county, if you are representing at larger area, describe that area. So we're describing the city of Houston, where it is, the geographic boundary, it's located, even though it may be obvious where Houston is located, you're still describing it as if you're talking to somebody from Mars, right? So we're, the city of Houston's located here, it's about this big, population is about this. And then you're going to do a deeper dive into the target area. And one of the reasons why it's important to define that geographic area too is that, capturing that in your grant, when you are able to use your funding, and you might find a site that's outside of your target area, but it's just one site that you really need to do because it ties into the need and the mission of your program, you are allowed a little bit of flexibility. And if you don't have that geographic area, if it's not within that geographic area, they're not going to allow you to go outside of that target area at all. So to describe that really well and dive in deep. Next slide. So the way that this is our criteria of how we describe, advise communities on selecting their target area. And a lot of times in smaller and rural communities, it may be obvious and it may be kind of just one or two options. In larger cities like the city of Houston, the city of Austin, LA, etc., you're going to have a lot of options to choose from. So across the board, we look for, it's really kind of basic. The need is there, the community need is there, and the concentration of brownfields are there. So you have distressed properties, you have an abundance of them. You can describe that. You can describe the need for the funding to address those, but you're also describing the community, the effects of those and the challenges of those brownfields on the community. We're looking at health disparities, economic disparities, social and environmental injustice within those communities. So you're describing all of that. And when you see that high need, you see this as a high, low income and low access community for food. When you're seeing just a trend in all of those disparities, we're looking for that. And then you're getting this funding. And this is both from the grant perspective, but also practically, when you get this funding, you want to be able to use it. So you want to be able to identify those strong community partners up front. And we want to make sure that we actually have organizations that in the local capacity that's going to be able to use that funding. So we're looking for the nonprofit developers, we're looking for land banks, we're looking for community development corporations, community-based organizations as well that are interested in unlocking these brownfields, and of course local government. So we want to make sure that we can activate this funding, and then we get into making sure that the outcomes here are aligned with the strategic objectives of the EPA, both with their larger strategic plan, which is referenced within the guidance document. But I also want to flag the Environmental Justice Action Plan that also has some key action items and initiatives that they want to advance. So the purpose of this program is not necessarily to advance one type of economic development. It is a more holistic approach in wanting to advance the climate action, environmental justice, housing, infrastructure improvements, things of that nature. So if all four of those align, where you get a community of high need, lots of distressed properties, revitalization capacity, they're ready to go, and they want to do what the EPA wants us all to do, then that's a perfect target area. Next slide. This is just a real quick example of how we broke that down when we were evaluating the Fifth Ward community and all communities within Houston. Fifth Ward, the Second Ward, Gulfton, various other. So we compared them with community need, availability of brownfields, revitalization, and then those expected outcomes. Next slide. So going back to this description, so getting into the details of those grant guidelines, I'm going to show an example here, but I do want to highlight, you're looking at the geographic boundary, as would have been discussed above. So in the last section, describing that boundary, identify and describe the specific target area where you plan to focus grant activities, such as a neighborhood, district, corridor, or census tract. So what we're really looking for is something that makes sense. And it can be a neighborhood, and it makes sense as that this is the boundary of this neighborhood based on social and historic definitions of a neighborhood. It could be a district, maybe it's a tax increment, incremental finance, a TIF district. Maybe it's a cultural arts corridor or an economic development corridor. And in some of the most simplest terms, defining it by the census tracts is a really great way to define your boundary, but you definitely want to define it very specifically. Next. And so here's an example, and KSU on their website has a whole lot of successful grant applications that they've submitted, or that others have submitted, and we've been able to grab as examples. So I encourage you to look. A lot of people do it in a little bit different way, but essentially the formula is the same, and you'll see that across all of them. So I just pulled in this one from our Kashmir Gardens Fifth Ward target neighborhood. Again, this is really condensed because of the length of the grant application. But so I usually put the population in parentheses so I don't have to write it all out. It consists of, in this case, it was 2 contiguous communities. So we just lumped that into one big one. It's situated on the northern banks of Buffalo Bayou. West boundary is Hardy Street. So we're actually using some of the streets around there to define it. And then and you can do it by also defined as the census tract, also defined as some other geographic features that can clearly, distinctly define it. Then I like to pull in a story that gives it a human component, and why do we care about this neighborhood? And this should tie back to some of your previous discussion in the previous sections about just the history of the area and why you're going after this grant. So for this neighborhood, this was a thriving African American community with a deep, cultural arts scene. It was known as the Broadway of the South and the original birthplace of Zydeco music. So the community is trying to preserve that, which is really important. And then why, what are the branches? Why, what happened? And why do we now have brownfields? And in this case, it's a classic case of urban renewal, which led to the construction of those interstates, which destroyed, it was over 900 Black-owned homes and businesses. And that was actually in the grant itself. I did have a reference to where we got that statistic. And then, because of this, we had a rapid decline, and that created the brownfields that we see today. Next. Okay, I think that's over to you, Sabine, or is this the panel discussion?
This is the panel discussion, right? So what we were thinking when we kind of put this together is just things up a little bit. We have like a couple of, actually only 2 little teeny tiny mini panel discussions in here. And basically it's going to be Danielle, who you just heard, and then Michelle from Marshalltown, Iowa, and myself. And we all have different, we're going to be wearing different hats for this, right? So Danielle, she's going to do more like from a larger metropolitan urban area, and Michelle is going to be having the perspective of a rural community, and I'm going to represent today like a multi-county rural area. So the question then would be, how do you select your target areas? What process and considerations were there for you to do so? I don't know, Michelle, you want to start out with that?
Sure. So real quick, Michelle Sponheimer, and I am the Housing and Community Development Director with the City of Marshalltown in Iowa. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a little bit. But just in general, I think from a small community, you know, we tend to know, Danielle kind of talked about, you have this large geographic area that you're working in a small community. For those of you that might be from smaller towns, you end up knowing who those people are. You know, it's like, well, that's Joe's property over there, and you know, that's Dave over there, and that's the old this site or the old that site. And so it does become, I think, a lot easier maybe in some respect, just because there are fewer sometimes places to choose from in selecting things. But as you're defining that target area, for us, you know, we've often looked at census tract, as Danielle mentioned. That's usually a good way to get data and being able to define those areas a little bit more, just because you can pull census data by your tract and some of that kind of demographic information that you might need. We also will sometimes use like our downtown district has kind of been our primary focus in our recent funding. Whereas we do open up, usually I open up my geographic, the entire city of Marshalltown, just for that reason that Danielle described. It's important to not cut yourself short by eliminating an opportunity within the larger geographic region, because something may come up that you weren't expecting. And so I do often on our case, we include typically our entire incorporated city limits, even though I know that I may not work in some of those areas. You can't predict some things. So, and then we kind of base down to often census tract for us in the smaller segment.
Cool, thanks. Maybe I'll go next because I have also the rural angle here. So I think I'm going to use an example. So there was an economic development district applying for a brownfield grant. They wanted to go for a, I don't know, I don't remember, it was a multi-purpose. Definitely, it was a larger assessment grant. And they had 11 counties. So what they decided to do was they took as a geographic boundary, it was the entire service area. So basically the 11 counties. And then they honed in with target areas to specific communities. And that was a little bit difficult because they had quite a few communities, as you can imagine, in these 11 counties. So they spent the year before they applied for this grant to actually go around, visit communities and see, okay, are you interested? Do you know what a brownfield is? Do you know what the benefits could be? And they looked at the brownfield sites that all these communities had. And then based on what they found, then they said, okay, we need like 3 communities that we will mention in the grant application, actually. So who would that be? And then they kind of narrowed down the list from that angle. The thing to be aware with that is sometimes you will talk with communities and they say initially, yes, okay, cool, we are on board, you know, it's all good. And then you go back after or just before you want to write the grant and you talk with them again, and all of a sudden it's, oh no, I don't think we want that anymore, because they had a turnover in local government. So just be aware that if you're dealing with multiple communities, that can happen, and you just kind of always need to have a backup. So they didn't go with census tracts or anything because they wanted to be as flexible as possible. And it was really for that type of grant application, it was not necessary. But again, like geographic service area, the larger one to give you the flexibility, and then you really focus in this case, it was individual communities.
Mhm.
Danielle, do you want to add more to what you already said?
Real quick, Danielle, before you
Michelle?
jump in, I'll just, an example of that, we actually work with the lead-based paint program with HUD, which has similar kind of criteria to the brownfields and your target and geographic. And we used to run multi-county. And one thing that I'd recommend doing when you're talking with those other communities to hopefully reduce that risk of them kind of backing out due to change in leadership is establishing a 28E agreement within those jurisdictions from the one that's maybe going to be the primary grantee to the other communities. And that then kind of secures things a little bit further down the line. If you're not sure when it might apply, you know that you've had a prior elected body that did approve and agree, has actually signed an agreement. So that's a little thing that you can do early in your phase to say, even if there's no commitment of cost sharing or anything of that nature, just that kind of setting that stage and positioning them for future to know that somebody along the line did think this was a good enough idea to actually vote on it.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of times, and just really briefly, I mean, realize that it takes time from the time that you actually start thinking about this to when you actually might have money in hand, right? I mean, keep that in consideration too. That's usually a year. And then all the prep work up front. So potentially, if you really want to be thorough, it's like a year and a half, 2 years. Danielle?
Yeah, no, to both of your points, and Michelle, I actually did the similar thing here in Houston, but we set up a memorandum of agreement between coalition partners, and I've seen that work throughout the country, especially when you're talking about regional governments and multi-counties. But I think too that kind of brings up the number of target areas that's appropriate. It might be one, especially if you're applying as a small town or a rural area and you have just one, and that's okay. But if you do have the option to incorporate 1, 2, maybe 3, 4 is pushing it in terms of having too much in there. I wouldn't recommend more than 3, but we can, having that flexibility between those target areas, because even if in one of those target areas, you're not doing as much of the phase 1s and phase 2s, and maybe it's more community engagement and prepping them to identify an inventory to prep them to do sites. That's an okay use of the funding as well, as long as you're touching those target areas. And in some cases, we actually write within the grant that X percent, typically 30% or less, may be used outside of the target areas for this reason that aligns with this cause. So in Houston, that would be Houston's the 4th largest city in the country. It's huge. It's the size of Rhode Island. So we have to have some of that flexibility because we have communities throughout the city that have brownfields that have need, and we want to be responsive. So we wrote in that anything aligned with certain initiatives, we would consider up to a certain percentage of that grant.
Yeah, this flexibility, I think that's really important. So as much as you can tailor your grants. And I mean, TAB has a bunch of successful grant applications on their website. So if you have time, and if you start early enough, scour for a few of those to see what people did and how they worded things. Not that you are encouraged to copy, but just kind of get some ideas. Mm-hmm. All right. One thing I want to mention, the MOAs. That's really, really important for the coalition grants. Obviously, that's a requirement. So for the example that I mentioned, when the community backed out, that was pre-MOA. And that was actually, talking to them again, okay, would you want to be one of those 3? And they said, no, we don't want to be anything, which was really a shame. Anyhow.
These now as a requirement.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So moving on, I think we're on a tight time schedule today because there's so much in this huge section. Description of the priority brownfield sites. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview here. This is where you provide an overview of the brownfield sites in your target area. So these areas that you really want to focus in on your grant, right? With the information of number, size, and the environmental concerns for each of those specific target areas, and be as specific as you can. Then specifically highlight 1 or more sites that are your priority sites. Somewhere you always need to discuss how you came up with these priority sites, right? What criteria did you use? And then include the information such as past and current land use, current site conditions, including structures, potentially related environmental issues. Again, whatever you write, look at the eval criteria. You make sure you hit everything. Never ever leave anything unanswered because it doesn't apply to you. Just say, this does not apply to me. Not necessarily this sections, but other ones in the grant application. Next slide, please. All right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle for an example.
All right, so for examples, well, first you want to set the stage. And again, coming back to that, there's an abundance of brownfields. How do we define a brownfield? You know, it's a property with either known or potential contamination. Right. So right out of the gate, we know that we can claim, you know, all of the voluntary cleanup sites, anything that's gone through leaking petroleum storage tank. If you have records that say, just as an aggregate, you know, we know that there's an abundance of cleanup sites in this area. And then you can drill down a little further into understanding, you know, if you have an inventory already, that's great, add that here. But if you can offer specific numbers, the EPA is really looking for those specific numbers. So pull in those metrics and demonstrate that even if it's 5 brownfield sites that are known, but we suspect there are more. And why do we know that they're brownfield sites? Illegal dumping, you know, again, leaking petroleum storage tanks, vacant lots a lot of times are brownfields based on historic use. And if you can tie it back to that original story in the beginning of, you know, so say you're in the Rust Belt cities, you know, with the big steel industry, we know that there's a lot of abandoned factories and there's this many of them. That's all really good specific information that you can add and measurable information you can add in that overview. Next slide. And here's some examples. Once you drill down, identifying the sites probably is one of the hardest things, because you don't want, you know, you're looking for something that will tell a story, but you also want some truth in wanting to be able to bring that back, you know, and use your funding on it. So ideally, and I'll call out this Velasco incinerator here on the bottom. That is a catalyst site. We call these catalyst sites that if you could just unlock and start redeveloping this one site that's really difficult, the rest of the revitalization of the area would take over, or the rest of whatever the community's objectives for that area would take hold. So Velasco incinerator would be one of those perfect sites, but we also identified a couple others within the 5th Ward, just to give an example. And again, the way that the EPA asks them, they give you what, 10 pages. And so you really have to condense and get straight into the meat of it and what exactly they're asking for. So when you're describing the site, you know, describing that history of why it potentially contaminated. And again, if you can tie it back to your original story, that's best. And then I like to, you know, just synthesize some of that information up top here. So, you know, the Hardy Yards, it's 43 acres and it's at this address, it's in this target area, in this census tract, and you know, anything that you can use to describe that, it really briefly, that's fair game. And then when you come down, it's 1 or 2 sentences about the historic use and now the current use. You know, historically used as a rail yard, currently vacant. And then the environmental issues. Why is this a problem? What are we addressing with the Brownfields funding? Talk specifically about the environmental contamination. That's going to be helpful in later sections when you talk about any kind of health disparities or health risk with the population and their exposure to some of these contaminations and the urgency of getting this funding to intervene. But what is also, why did you select this? What is the potential here? So we had that under selection criteria. Why was that important? That aligns with your, again, all of this, everything within your grant needs to align and tell the story between sections. So we called out our selection criteria in prioritizing sites somewhere else in the grant, I think probably under revitalization section. So we aligned that site with affordable housing. And as you come down through these 3 examples, you'll see there's different ways that we presented these sites. Next slide. And actually the first slide that we landed on shows one snapshot from our peer tool. Our peer tool is a collaboration that Community Lattice did with Kansas State University TAB program, which was funded through data.org, independently funded, to create a platform to make it easy to find environmental records. So that is available. And if you're looking at, well, you know, there's a corner gas station, let's say, you know, it's a corner gas station, but if there's a link there that will send you to tell you how many tanks are on the site, what the conditions of those, the status of that record is. So it just helps you find those records. And if you can find those records, then you can incorporate that into your grant application. So I've actually found a lot of sites that the community has identified, and understanding, okay, is this a brownfield? Is it not a brownfield? What is the potential risk in terms of the environmental? But doing a local record search, really quickly being able to say, oh, that's right next door to an old gas station that had a leaking petroleum storage tank. You know, those are the type of examples that we're using. And there is a webinar on this, so I'm not going to go into detail. I don't know if that's on the next slide. I think Jen reorganized my slides. Dana, can you go next? Oh, that's the next slide. Okay, so the next slide shows you some deeper dive into the peer tool and some of the available information that's out there. Those links into the data sources go into the actual original source of the data, so you can do a little deeper dive there, but it's a platform for just, you know, exploring environmental records. So use that however you would like as you're developing that inventory and describing properties. Go to the next slide. And that's the webinar that we did about a year ago. It's on the TAB website. If you go to that link, and you can do a deeper dive tutorial. It is hopefully a fairly user-friendly platform. And I think Dana just put the link in the chat. And if she didn't, I will soon. So for more information, go there. Next slide. And we go right into another discussion.
Yeah, another mini panel. Who would have thought? So same cast here, Danielle, Michelle, myself. So this time the question would be, how did you select your priority brownfield sites? I mean, you're not going to wake up one morning and say, oh yeah, I dreamt about the site, right? Let's take that one. Or you walk by a site that looks really blighted, disgusting, ugly, and say, oh yeah, I could make that my priority site. So there is more to that process. So what is it, and what advice could we potentially dispense here? So Michelle, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. So, you know, for me in a small town, sometimes it is just that kind of, you walk by it and it's that ugly site that everyone looks at. It is just that easy. You know, and then you try to get maybe some of the additional data and things to go support, you know, some of those feelings that are out there. I think a little bit in what I'll get into here shortly is really thinking about the planning side of it, and, you know, what you uncover through various community engagement pieces, and, you know, learning about history of properties, you know, from the people in the community can really help to prioritize, you know, some of those things, and thinking about the opportunities for the redevelopment. You know, we all, I think, probably know sites that, you know, are just never going to be able to be turned over, never going to, you know, really have that chance. And so there's not necessarily maybe a value in spending a lot of time focusing on a site that is very unlikely to redevelop too. So I think, you know, taking into consideration kind of all those, you know, aspects is important when you're selecting them, you know, at least for a small town. It just becomes really quite personal, you know, and picking sites, you know, sometimes.
Right. And I think a lot of times also what it boils down to, you need to have cooperative property owners. I mean, it doesn't do you any good if you select the site and then the property owner says, yep, nope, sorry, no
Right.
deal. And I mean, I know some other selection criteria that are employed quite a bit are like, what is the redevelopment benefiting the community, right? I mean, what is the priority for the community for revitalization? What is the overarching goal, and how does that site fit the bill? And then is it like the potential for timely and successful redevelopment? Is it something that would really take a very, very long time? Or is it something that has more of an immediate benefit to the community? So I'd say gather a lot of community input and feel your community out and see what do they think. I mean, don't walk it alone as a grant applicant. I mean, any type of utilities and stuff that might, the whole infrastructure connected to a site. I mean, that might be a selection criterion as well. Danielle?
So, yeah, what I would encourage, I mean, I go out to a lot of the sites that we have included in a lot of the grants that I've helped to write have been really those sites that have been selected by the community, that they said, that Velasco incinerator, everybody knows that site. That is a classic brownfield here. And we're really looking for those sites that really tell that story too. And that's a site that we've been, honestly, it's been in like 2 or 3 grants at this point. But at the beginning, we didn't think it was going to get unlocked. It's locked up right now, I think at the city. Just being able to redevelop is really complicated. However, the grant application, the grant eligibility criteria does allow you to do a lot of planning around it, allows for investigation. So I would encourage people not to write off some of those kind of more challenging sites, especially if it's something the community really wants and if it tells the story and aligns with it, because you never know, there could be some activity that could unlock. We could do a community visioning. You could discover from a survey that, this is actually far more complicated than the owner might think it is. And that realization and having a plan for it may help to move it along. So even if it's a small piece, just to start to unlock, the Brownfields program is intended to put these properties back into productive reuse. So whatever avenue we can get there, we should get there.
And I think the community input, I mean, that part is really important, especially for an EPA grant application. If you can document that the sites that you selected, yes, I mean, you went through sort of the input session with the community, you did visioning, there are plans there that are supported by the community and not top down from the local government. I mean, that carries quite a bit of weight.
Oh, on that plan part, and Michelle, we went through this exercise with you. A lot of times brownfields are identified in planning documents that to somebody who might not be looking at it through a brownfields lens, but might not see that that's a brownfield. So we go back to those city plans, those community plans, and if they say there's this many vacant lots or there's an old hospital over here, it's not going to be named as a brownfield in a lot of the planning documents. So mining those, and if there's public, that also goes back to the planning in the revitalization plan section of the application.
Yeah, and a lot of communities, especially like smaller and rural communities, they have blight studies. Mm-hmm. And so I would recommend looking at those, see what properties, usually, as you said, Danielle, I mean, sometimes the properties are named actually, with street address and everything. Mm-hmm. And again, it also goes back to the point that there are still a lot of communities out there who don't know what a brownfield site is, but they know what a blighted site is. And I mean, that's usually the same. So
yeah, I think that's the very true, Danielle, you pointed out, we started, working after applying for our community assessment, not getting funded. We got connected with KSU TAB for our community and, and having some of those conversations with you and Jen and others around the table, I realized, I've been doing brownfield development for 20 years. I just didn't ever call it that, and so it was just different things that we thought it was like, it was just a property that needed to come down because we knew it had asbestos, because we knew it had this. And, you don't think about that because we're just not maybe exposed to it in the smaller communities. Once you kind of have that in your sites, it's like, this is what this really means. And you can explain that to community members and councils and things like that. It really does paint a different picture because, you open up different doors for how to deal with these sites that maybe you didn't think you had an opportunity before. So it does change your way of thinking about them as well once you start to understand that. And that's where that community education opportunities come in and are so important, that are available either through the grant funding or just on your own. There's a lot of like very low cost things you can start to do as a community, to get that education piece. So people start to think a little bit differently about redevelopment sites.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes also, if you can, and I mean, you might not be in a position to do so depending geographically where you are, but if you can connect with, like, say, a previous grantee or a current grantee, and to say, hey, why don't you come to our community if you are at don't quite know, where to start or whatever. And of course, K-State TAP can help you with that too. But have somebody else look at your sites and kind of go through the sites with you and say, okay, what could be the problems? What could be the solutions here? And that might make it clearer too. I mean, again, that goes to the point starting early. I mean, none of this you can do last minute, really.
And then the point of starting early and the importance of identifying community partners. And again, we want the funding to be used. So we want people to be able to apply for the funding and use them on assessing the brownfield sites. Asking some of those partners as you're putting this together, and feeling that out, if you're bringing in the community development corporations or this community based organizations or the church network, I know that's big within cities, asking them and probing a little bit deeper into what they're trying to do. And if they say, well, we're really into historic preservation, most of the historic preservation is on a brownfield site. Somebody's paying asbestos, and that might not be something that they put together. And once they do, they start, oh, well, there's that site, and then there's that site, and it kind of comes together.
Yep, absolutely.
I think maybe, I don't know, Sabina, if you do we want to address any? I saw that there is at least one kind of comment question in the chat, just related to, resources out there and photos, especially in maybe rural areas. I know in communicating, I'm not sure what state, you're from, but at least in Iowa, even connecting, with your DNR offices, too, if they've had specific brownfield sites that maybe they've worked on a state level with the community, can be a really good source. Here in Iowa, we have Mel Pins, for many of you might know Mel. I mean, gosh, that man has so many photos of different places. If you want a photo, that's kind of a place that you can go, is some of those folks. And, obviously KSU TAB, too, has, that bigger, broader base where they've probably seen some good examples. So I think there's a lot out there once you start getting connected with some of these groups that can help.
Yeah, and you can even bill for the internet. I mean, that's, in the meantime, there's so much out there. If you go to the EPA website, and usually the pictures that are on the EPA website, you can lift. I mean, there are some good examples on there as well.
Well, I think that brings up to the important, the story does just, I mean, the pictures do tell a story. So as you're in later sections here, going into preparing your budget and your scope, allowing for capturing the story of your brownfields redevelopment and capturing those pictures and engaging with the community, and just make sure that it's not just the technical aspects that matter.
Yeah, for sure, not for this grant application. Brownfields grant applications, I find, are a lot different from any other type of grant application, because EPA wants to hear this story, and you need to be able to tell a good one. All right, so maybe we're going to segue right into any questions that our audience may have. I don't see anything in the chat except for the question about the pictures. If you have questions, we'll just kind of give you a minute to post them in the chat. And if there's nothing there, we're going to move right on. Let's wait a little bit. Nothing? Okay, and there are going to be other opportunities to ask questions throughout, right? So if something occurs to you in a little bit, I mean, we'll answer them if we can later. Okay, so this is another subsection of this big umbrella section of project area description and plans for revitalization that we're going to be talking about now, which is the revitalization of the target area. So here is what EPA wants to know. What you need to write to is reuse strategy for your brownfield sites, for your priority sites, and the alignment with any revitalization plans that you may have. In case of the multi-purpose grant, it's the alignment with the overall plan for revitalization. And then, of course, the outcomes and the benefits of that reuse strategy. Why are you doing that? What good is it going to be, right? What is the end goal here? Next slide, please. So here again is the text and the first bullet, what is in the request for proposal, in this case for the community-wide assessment and cleanup grants. They are identical in the language, and then underneath it is the except from the evaluation criteria that will be used to evaluate basically your write-up. So what you need to do, you need to describe your reuse strategy or your projected reuse, and then discuss how the reuse, gotta talk anymore, the reuse strategy or projected reuse aligns with and advances the local government's land use and revitalization plans or related community priorities. So usually once you have your site selected, and by this time, obviously, you know your project, you know where you want to go. You just need to be clear and concise and to convey this to your audience. So your evaluation criteria here is that you really are clearly identifying for the priority brownfield site or sites, the reuse strategy or the projected reuse. And then also make clear that your reuse strategy or the projected reuse aligns with and advances the local government's land use and revitalization plans or related community priorities. So this is the nexus maybe to your comp plan, to your master plan, to your revitalization plan. So whatever reuse revitalization plans you have for your community or for the area that you're gonna be working in. Next slide, please. So here's the same thing for the multi-purpose grant, because that language differs a little bit. Now here it asks if you have an overall plan for the revitalization of brownfield sites within the target area that already exists. That plan that already exists, identify the overall plan for the revitalization, feasible site reuse strategies for at least one of the priority sites, so you don't need to have them for all, and discuss how the proposed multi-purpose grant activities aligns with that plan. And then you need to discuss how the plan aligns with and supports, again, the local government's broader land use and revitalization plans or related community priorities. And the eval criteria are pretty much identical with the assessment grant ones. Next slide. So also for the multi-purpose grant, there is another option for this question really that you need to answer here. If you don't have an overall plan for revitalization of the brownfield sites within that chosen target area, then you need to describe how the activities that you will perform under the grant once you get it will result in an overall plan for revitalization of brownfield sites. So that is a little bit, you have a little bit more flexibility in there, because of course you should have thought about your overall revitalization plan already for your area, but while you write your brownfields plan, I mean, you can be a little bit more flexible as to what will be in this plan, because at this point it's a little bit, or it is hypothetical. So, and again, you need to discuss your brownfields revitalization plans will align with and support the local government's broader land use and revitalization plans or related community priorities. And the eval criteria are then identical to the assessment in the multi-purpose grant that already had a revitalization plan incorporated. Just realize for the multi-purpose grant, I mean, the gist of it is, you have an overall plan for revitalization already, or you don't, and you need to write towards that. Next slide, please. All right, Michelle, I think that is you.
It is. So I like photos. I am a storyteller, I think, in a lot of our work. So you're going to see some photos in these next couple of slides with some things. So I kind of just tried to highlight, really kind of thinking about this whole webinar today, kind of from start to finish, a little bit about how we're approaching, things from the identification of the sites and the planning aspect of it. And so I wanted to share, if you just stay on that first one, thank you. Share just a couple of the sites here and how we are kind of doing that selection. Marshalltown, just from a general population, we're around 27,000. So we're about as big as the neighborhood that Danielle talked about in the beginning, our entire community. But we have a couple things that, we've been looking at and talking about as far as brownfield sites over the past several years. And as I mentioned, maybe I didn't realize they're brownfield sites to begin with, but now kind of looking at it differently. So one of the big things that happened about 5 years ago, Marshalltown did experience an EF3 tornado that came through our community. And it went right down the Main Street corridor of our town, our whole northern half. And so sometimes you don't necessarily think about a site as being a brownfield site until a tornado rips half of it away, like you can see in the one picture there. And so that really kind of created for us some new opportunities is how I'd like to look at them for thinking about redevelopment, specifically in our downtown, where before these are maybe underutilized buildings that were still had environmental issues, but just weren't as much of maybe a priority to us as to when they became a point of destruction. And so, sometimes you have to take those things that happen, whether they be a natural event. We've also had a couple intentional fire, arson situations. So those are not as fun either. But they give you maybe a new opportunity to look at a site that you hadn't thought about. And so you can't always plan for those. That's one thing that it's hard to plan for. But once you've kind of established them, it's a good thing to kind of keep in your pocket as knowing what brownfields are about so you can help address them. Another example I wanted to share was just like an industrial site. This is a large site. It's like 14 acres in our community, pretty much at the heart of our community. It's along a creek that runs through with a trail. There's a lot of buildings there. They're underutilized. One was destroyed by a derecho wind event, which we had in 2020. And then just after I even did these slides, one of them caught fire last week. So, it's a site that has issues. It's been a long time, not necessarily abandoned, but definitely underutilized. One that we've tried to work with the owner to work with brownfields, and we kind of hit a wall. Then you make some progress, you hit a wall. And so we just keep coming back to it as a potential. So it's one of those that we leave on there, kind of as Danielle was talking about, where you don't know when the right situation might open up. It's actually listed for sale. So, my hopes are high that maybe somebody will come along and we'll be able to turn over some new opportunities here and maybe do some assessments under our community-wide grant that we have right now. And then the other one is a hospital site. And this is one that, again, sometimes that you have a site in your community where part of it's utilized. This hospital right now, the picture you're seeing is really the old portion of the hospital, but it had like 7 additions over 100 years. And the old historical part was basically just shuttered, and, all the asbestos and lead and all that stuff still remains. It just wasn't dealt with. They added on to address their needs. Now they've vacated the complex, built a new building. And we're kind of left with this large site at the core of our downtown. It's right at the footprint of our downtown at the end of the corridor. And, there's great opportunity there, but there's a lot of issues. We really had hoped we would be able to kind of get a developer in as the hospital turned over. Unfortunately, sometimes these kind of properties get picked up by folks that are maybe just looking for a way to play some games with, the taxes and the finances and things like that. So that's kind of the situation where we're in with this site right now. But it's one that we're still watching, and it's definitely part of our story because it is such a key location. And so we kind of just, my thought was thinking about these sites is that you're always kind of just being prepared for what might come, thinking about what's out there. So if you go to the next slide, please. Excuse me. To talk about the planning side of it and the visioning. So I've been with the Community Marshalltown for over 20 years now, and we've gone through a lot of different planning events, comp plans, as Sabine mentioned, different more site-specific plans or area-specific plans, looking at our downtown or a certain corridor. So I mentioned that hospital site, knowing that that hospital was phasing into a new construction project for several years, we knew that there was going to be opportunity there. And so we had to think about, we had to think about what we were going to be doing for redevelopment. It's a privately owned site. We really, had somewhat limitation from a city perspective in our involvement at this point, but we certainly could try to make the best case to entice developers that would hopefully have the same vision that our community did. So after our tornado event in 2018, we were very fortunate to have a local foundation that granted $100,000 to do a downtown master plan. We were able to use that, leverage those funds to match EDA funding, Economic Development Administration federal funding, for another $100,000. So we had $200,000 to do a downtown master plan, recognizing that we had significant impact due to the wind event. And we were going to have an opportunity to rebuild in many areas. And so it was an accelerated process that we went through. It had a huge amount of community engagement in it. And it really, gave us the opportunity to think about where do we want to be. And so those planning processes that you go through are so important that you don't really always know where they're going to take you and what's going to come out of the priority from the plan and what will actually get implemented. But without that, it's really hard to tell these stories when you go to apply for the grant dollars. So that was something that, those plans are really important to us. The hospital graphic there is actually from another plan that we did that was specific about the highway corridor that kind of runs right along that hospital intersection. And so what we saw, that plan was done in 2018 before the tornado. And then when we did the master plan in 2019, we really wanted to make sure that those two plans were building from each other. We're not starting fresh. They were actually different consulting groups that did each of them. But we wanted to say, we've already spent some effort in doing this. We want to build on that. And how can we continue that effort? So I always try with any of our planning efforts on a local level. And I think as you're working in your own community or working with other communities, is to make sure that you are looking at those plans. And that's one thing that, Danielle and her team with Community Lattice did, helped us to kind of review those plans, as she mentioned, and pull out some of those highlights of different things and how they connect to each other and really kind of bring to light the brownfield aspect of it in this case for us. But a lot of the times people kind of look at plans and say, oh, it's just something you put on a shelf and you don't ever go back to it. And I always challenge people that you need to keep it, on the front line of what you're doing and recognize that things don't always work out exactly as you had them, but there's actually a lot of implementation that happens in a plan if you kind of keep it in front of you. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we've done with the downtown, as I mentioned, we do have community wide assessment grant currently, and then we were able to partner with the EPA to do some technical assistance work as well. And that really has been a great partnership between all of that work. We were able to take two major sites in our downtown. Each of those little yellow squares actually consists of 4 or 5 lots where we lost buildings due to the wind events that we had over a 2-year period. And so we were able to take, recognizing that these are 2 corners now that have a prime opportunity for redevelopment. In the downtown, we want to grow that tax base. It's a priority for our community that we not just let those become just green space or parking lots on our main street. And we want to see them redeveloped. And so we knew we needed to get some more input from the community beyond what we had in our plans. We really needed to target in on these 2 particular sites. And so as part of our planning dollars that we had in our assessment grant and the EPA technical assistance, we were able to do some market analysis and some visioning. We had an event downtown that was going on where we ended up setting up 2 stations, one at each corner. And we had people who are walking by just put up basically pictures of what would you want to see here? You know, is it a 2-story building? Is it a 3-story building? Does it have housing? Does it an office? Is it park space? Is it, you know, a rooftop bar? As you kind of see what we ended up with for graphics. And so with that, we took all that information. We had an online survey where we got more detailed into those ideas. And then we worked with ICF under the technical assistance side to do some analysis of those different things. How much square footage do we have? How much can we support with our retail needs within our community, or, you know, all those different things. And then through KSU, we were able to partner with South Dakota State University to do some renderings for us on what would, if we were to build these kind of vision, what does that look like for us? And so taking all those pieces together and then preparing them to our next step here coming up is going to be going out for kind of a request for proposals for these sites to entice a developer who can hopefully make some of this happen. So we have a couple of corners that we hope to be redeveloped. So then eventually I'll have those after pictures to put in a future slide for that. But for now, this is kind of where we're at in this visioning stage of redevelopment. And next slide, please. And last, I just kind of mentioned that partnership, I think, so important to all of these processes, as we've been talking about so far, is those partnerships that you build, whether they're with your community organizations. For us, our downtown and our chamber have been involved. You know, partners coming through KSU TAB and through our grants, our federal partners, our state partners on all these. It really does take that large swath of folks to make some of these kind of projects happen. And so it's really important to just keep building those relationships because you don't always know maybe when something is going to happen. At one of our sites, one of those downtown sites, we had just acquired one of the buildings, and then an arsonist set fire to the building. And thankfully, the Iowa Brownfield Development Malpins, and I mentioned, he called me up. He's like, I saw it on the news, and he's like, I've got $25,000 to help you clean that up. And I'm like, great, sweet, well, let's do it. So, you know, those kind of things, if you have the partnership there, it's makes a world of difference when you actually need it and the time comes. So it's really important to just kind of keep that as a focus throughout any of the work that you're doing on this. And I think that's my last slide. Yep. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So back to the actual outline of the grant application. So in the previous section, you were asked to kind of lay out your revitalization plans, you know, tell them how that meshes with the plans that your community has already regarding community revitalization, area revitalization. And now, of course, EPA also wants to know what are the outcomes? What are the benefits of what you want to do? So what you see on this slide here is the ask, basically. The first 1, 2, 3 bullets there, what was in last year's grant in the RFP, the request for proposal for community-wide assessment, cleanup grants, and multi-purpose grants, right? So they want to know what does your project do? So if it's economic development in the target areas, you need to describe that. What's going to happen upon completion of the cleanup? For example, if you go for a cleanup grant, or even project it out, if this is just your assessment, what could happen? What is the potential, it says here, of the proposed project or the revitalization plans, right? And if it's not economic development, or if there is a mix there, how does the grant, or will the grant facilitate the creation of, preservation of, or addition to a park, a greenway, undeveloped property, recreational property, or other property used for nonprofit purposes in the target area? So you can have a mixture here, but you need to say what you think this will become. And if the stronger you can make that point, obviously, the better it is, the more points you will get. Another aspect of the subsection, or another ask, is you need to describe, if that's applicable, how the reuse will facilitate renewable energy from wind, solar, or geothermal energy. For a lot of redevelopments, that may not be the case, but it could be coming stronger in the next few years. But at the least, most communities who write these plans will be able to incorporate energy efficiency measures. I mean, if you have a park, that might be a little bit hard to do, but there could be something there. Think outside the box. Do not let this little smidget here go unanswered. I mean, you need to put something there. And energy efficiency, I mean, that goes to climate resiliency. I mean, they don't tell you that in here, but that's really what that's for. And there are a lot of things you can do, and our next speaker will be able to give you some pointers here and some examples. The other thing not to forget is if your proposed project or the revitalization plans may potentially cause a displacement of residents, here we're talking gentrification, and or businesses, you need to describe how you're going to mitigate that, right? How can you make this as little as possible? How can you minimize it? Again, do not forget to answer that. If your project does not cause displacement, just put a sentence in there, our project will not cause displacement of residents and or businesses. Otherwise, I can guarantee you lose at least a half a point or a point. And basically, the eval criteria will speak to what you are putting on paper there for this section. Just be thorough with everything. All right, Brenda, next one. The segue was here, the climate mitigation.
Thanks,
Climate
Sabine.
impact mitigation.
I appreciate the introduction. I'm Brenda Dix. I work for ICF. We do a lot of support for EPA as well. So next slide. All right, let's skip ahead one more. So what I'm going to talk about is quickly trying to help you increase your understanding of climate risks and how they relate to brownfields, explaining the benefits of including climate change resilience in your revitalization projects, and then providing examples of climate resilience strategies that you could consider along with some case studies of where they've been applied. Next slide. All right, so first, we hear this time and time again in these applications, right? You want to be able to tell the story. And one of the stories you can tell about your revitalization project is that you're helping to address climate change risks, that these are increasing risks, they're already a problem and will become even worse moving forward, right? We look at stats like in 2021, there were at least $20 billion weather and climate disasters in the US. And over time, that number has increased on average quite considerably. And there are risks undoubtedly across the country. So no matter where you are, there's some sort of climate related risk that you're likely facing and should be considering during revitalization. Some of the risks, if you don't consider them, is increased and repeated damage over time, right? If we're going through this whole process, we don't necessarily want to have to go back and fix flood damages, fire damages, things of that nature. That there could be higher management and insurance costs if you don't consider these risks. And obviously, if you don't consider them, they can be negative human health and environmental impacts when disasters do occur. And I think it's important to point out that, there are a lot of members of vulnerable populations that live close to brownfields, and those same people are also the most at risk to climate change impacts and most likely to live in areas that will be impacted. And so you have an opportunity through these redevelopment projects to improve the quality of life for these populations and address these impacts of climate change. So, next slide. Okay, so in this part of your application, right, you're talking about the outcomes and the benefits. So what are the outcomes and benefits of including climate resilience in your reuse strategy? Well, you can point to the fact that you're being proactive, that by considering these types of risks and addressing them through your revitalization project, you're going to require less maintenance and repair. You're going to increase community resilience potentially through more resilient infrastructure and reliable services. You're going to be able to increase property values and attract additional green investment, right? There's going to be a lot of environmental benefits as well. So some of them that will become clearer in my examples might be improved stormwater management as you're trying to reduce flooding impacts, improved water quality, air quality, and wildlife habitats. And obviously the community benefits as well. climate change poses major human health and public health issues. So if you can start to tackle that in your areas, you can increase recreation space, green jobs, and environmental justice as some of the co-benefits of the strategies that are commonly used for climate resilience. Next slide. So real quick, just how is the climate changing? We're seeing increasing heavy precipitation and floods. This chart or figure on the far left there, that's showing historical change between 1958 and 2012. So you can see in the Northeast, for example, a 71% increase in very heavy precipitation events. I think we're all seeing these types of stories on the news, major flooding here, major flooding there. And this map is sort of telling that story. And that's before even considering the fact that these types of impacts are projected to get even worse moving forward. And I'm going to have links for how you can figure out what the changes are and the projections are for your area as well towards the end. For the extreme heat waves, this particular map is more forward-looking. It's showing you the changes in temperature on the hottest days of the year under different future scenarios. So looking out to 2100, on the left, you're seeing your sort of best case scenario. If we stopped globally producing greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow sort of situation, you'd still be seeing, 3 to 4 degrees hotter on the hottest days in 2100, just due to what's already been emitted. The worst case on the right there, you could be seeing 15 plus degrees hotter on the hottest days. And extreme heat is the number one climate related cause of deaths in the United States and throughout the world. So they call it the silent killer. It is a major problem. The more we can increase shading, help to try to reduce temperatures in our urban environments, it's really going to go a long ways. On the right, you see sea level rise. This map is also historical looking over the last 100 years or so. You can see in the Gulf Coast, the red arrows, orange, yellow, you're seeing 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise per year just historically. And the reason why it's different, there's subsidence in those areas as well. The land is sinking while the seas are rising. And so you kind of get that double whammy there. And those trends are also expected to increase over time. So you'll see faster rates of sea level rise moving into the future, which obviously means when you get a coastal storm, you're going to get a lot more flooding coming in. Next slide. So the last slide was sort of the primary events that we anticipate. This is sort of some of the secondary events. We are seeing changing drought conditions. I know that's a big concern for many of you. We're seeing more frequent and severe wildfires, especially out west. So this map is showing you increases of the number of days of fire danger moving forward. So seeing increases of like 10 to 20 days moving forward. We see stronger and more frequent storms. So that's your tornadoes, your lightning and hurricanes. All of those types of storms are anticipated to occur more frequently. We're also seeing a decrease in snowfall and snowpack, which has major implications for water sources and other things. Next slide. Okay, this is a slide I promised on where you can find more information. I don't think you can click these links in Zoom, but I'm not usually a Zoom user. But I know these slides will be posted. And they're pretty easy to use resources. A couple on the overarching area there. This is a combination of both narrative text and actual mapping tools where you can put in your county, put in your city, put in your exact address and pull up how have things changed so far? How are things going to continue to change? What are the hottest days I would expect to see? How much rain am I going to get? Those types of things. And then there's more specific sources for inland flooding and coastal flooding in the FEMA flood maps. A lot of great resources on heat at heat.gov, and both NOAA and NASA have some great sea level rise tools available. And obviously the US Drought Monitor can give you some drought information. Next slide. All right, so enough of the doom and gloom part. Let's talk about what you can do. What are the strategies you should have in the back of your mind as sort of win-win solutions that could be used and deployed in your redevelopment strategy? For flooding, starting there, you can incorporate green infrastructure, by which I mean things like green roofs, so roofs that have vegetation on them, rain gardens or bioswales that help to capture and absorb rainwater so that it doesn't just flood into our streets and overwhelm our stormwater systems. You could also elevate structures out of the floodplain, whether that means your whole building is elevated, like you have to walk up a couple of steps to get to the first floor, or it could mean elevating infrastructure within that building. So that could mean instead of putting mechanical equipment in the basement, maybe it's on the second or third floor if you have that many floors. You can also look to nature-based solutions to increase floodwater storage capacity. So when you're along a river or a stream, could you widen that natural floodplain to provide room for flooding before it starts to hit buildings, infrastructure, things of that nature? Could you protect and expand the wetlands that are already there or restore stream bank vegetation? These are the things that have historically protected us and helped us, but maybe haven't been looked at in quite a while. Next slide. So as a quick example, in Iowa City, the Riverfront Crossing District redevelopment, on this slide, excuse me, you can see some major flooding that happened there in June of 2008. That sort of darker brown color is all floodwaters. On the right, you can see the sub-area boundary outlined in black and the floodplain outlined in blue. Significant risk of flooding under the 100-year storm shown in that area, which is a pretty good match with what you're seeing on the left in terms of actual flooding during some events. Next slide. So after that event, there was an effort undertaken to say, let's re-envision this. Let's come up with a redevelopment plan that's going to make sense. It's going to give the water a place to go. It's going to make sure that we don't have, if you saw in the last picture, our wastewater treatment plant right in the middle of the floodplain. So as you can see here, if they can tell the story that we're giving a lot more space for nature, a lot more space for flooding, because we know these flood impacts are going to continue to happen and occur. And so that's why you see so much green space along the riverfront. But that green space isn't just sitting there, right? It can be used for recreation when there isn't flood events. So next slide. This is just more pictures of the constructed wetland on the left, really using that to absorb water. The riverfront trail on the right, you can see sort of that gradual increase in slope of the sides as well to both be able to provide that room for flooding, but then hopefully cap it before the floodwaters reach the buildings that are a little bit further inland from the river. Next slide. These are some constructed photos of that wetland in the top left, some of the recreation areas. On the right, you can actually see on those buildings, the sort of white large blocks sort of on the ground level. That's one of those flooding strategies I was talking about of could you elevate the structure a little bit? And that's what that's basically serving as, is a flood barrier around the bottom of the buildings. Next slide. All right, so what about heat? What could you do for that? What are some of those win-win strategies that would be easy to incorporate, but you can tell that story that you're being very proactive and thinking about these risks and providing benefits to the community by making it a less hot place to live and recreate and work. To the extent you can reduce pavement, that's really helpful. Pavement really absorbs heat and then reflects it back up and just makes the whole thing feel a bit like an oven. Where you can't reduce pavement, you could use lighter colored materials. You could incorporate creative shading and heat mitigation into your building design, whether that's big fancy things like the shades in the picture on the right, or just awnings on your buildings, or put some umbrellas up, anything of that nature. You can also incorporate green infrastructure. I know I talked about that for flooding, but it helps with heat as well, having those green roofs and bioswales. You can plant more native trees and other vegetation to provide shading. We all know how nice it is to sit under the shade of a tree. But when you do so, make sure that you're using heat and drought tolerant species. And you could also consider, is there room within our redevelopment plan for a cooling center, someplace that could be a temporary shelter during extreme heat? Next slide. So here's an example of where extreme heat was really considered and addressed. The Marshall School, you can see in these pictures before, it's a lot of pavement, just everywhere, which, as I said, is really not great for extreme heat concerns. Next slide. So in this redevelopment plan, you can see just one of the main things that pops out to you at first glance, a lot of trees, right? A lot of those green circles, a lot more green space. If you go to the next slide, it highlights more of the specific elements that would help with resilience. So you can see that on the sort of bottom side, that more neon green color, there's going to be a green roof incorporated into 2 of the buildings. You can also see just in the darker green how much green space is being incorporated. The solar parking canopies, right? Those obviously have renewable energy benefits, but they also provide shading for the cars and for the vehicles that are parked underneath them, so that you don't have to get into so hot of a car at the end of the day. Then you also see permeable paving being incorporated, the rain gardens and bioretentions and bioswales. So this is really helps with some of the heat by taking out some of the paving material, but also is going to help with those flooding events, right? To capture rain, to keep it from flooding the site. Okay, next slide. So this is just a quick rundown of sort of all the heat mitigation techniques. I'll just tick through it real quickly. On the site, I talked about those solar parking canopies, bus stop shelters, the permeable pavement, the rain gardens, the bioretention planters, using those trees and native species, and using light surfaces where possible, or light colored paint to reduce heat absorption and increase reflection. And in the building, improving the building performance. We think of these things as helping with energy efficiency, right? Your insulation, replace glazing, but they definitely also help with keeping the building cooler, naturally cooler as well. Using those green roofs, using cool roofs or white or light colored roofs where it's not a green roof, incorporating vegetated walls, which is very neat. Some of those sun shading devices, so that might be things like awnings or other just small flanges, and some energy efficient appliances. So next slide. For drought, what are the strategies you could be using? You could be diversifying your options for water supply, planting drought tolerant species. It's a lot of the same as the flooding ones, frankly, that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and establishing regular maintenance of vegetation to reduce wildfire risks. Next slide. So what's an example of this? Michelle talked a lot about the tornado impacts, obviously. So I'm going to give you a different taste of that from the green infrastructure improvement side. Next slide. So here, the desire, right, is to say, we don't get rain all that often. When we do, it's heavy. How do we capture it for reuse on the site in our plantings and for our vegetation, so that we don't have to use as much water? And so what you're seeing is the digging of sort of cisterns, of tree wells, of really these areas that can capture and hold water, which, like I said before, helps in a flooding situation to keep the water out of the storm drains and make sure that system's not overwhelmed. But they installed pumps in them so that the water that is held in there and captured in there could then be pumped for watering in times when you don't have rainfall. Next slide. So what did this look like when it was completed? You can see that on the top left, there's sort of that notch in the curb there where the water can flow into that tree well. You can see some of the bioswale on the top right that really allows that water to fill in, flow into that area, be captured in some of these cisterns, and just some of the nice other native vegetation and plantings and additional water related and capture related features. Next slide. All right, so what are actions you can take now? First, just start asking people about past weather impacts. What has happened in the past is the best indicator of what will happen in the future. And you can use that narrative and that perspective to really help tell that story of what are the risks, how are you going to address them and create benefits for the site. You can look into the projected changes in climate using some of those resources that I shared once the slide is posted. You should be talking to the community about their climate change concerns and their resilience needs, and starting to identify the win-win resilience strategies you could work into your redevelopment plan. So once you have sort of a baseline sense of, you know, heat might be a problem here, or flooding might be a problem here, look back at this deck, get inspired, say, you know, we should definitely be including more trees on the site. It's going to help with a number of things. You can also talk to TAB to understand how to sell the story of climate change risks and the benefits of weaving climate resilience into your reuse strategy, or reach out to EPA about technical assistance if you're saying, I took a look at those maps and it looks like a very complicated story. I need some help with a deeper dive on risks and opportunities. So next slide. All right, one more, just a quick pitch for Brownfields 2023. I'll be there and we'll be presenting in 2 sessions that are listed here. One training on climate smart communities and accelerating brownfield and land revitalization actions. And then one town hall on where do we start, key decision points for climate smart brownfield and land revitalization choices. But I know there's a lot of other great climate resilience sessions as well. So I hope to see you there.
All right. Thank you very much, Brenda.
Thanks.
Very interesting. All right, so last subsection, big session. But before we do that, I think we have maybe minutes for questions, if there are any. So I don't see anything new in the chat. If you have a question that you're dying to ask it, please. We're gonna give it maybe 30 seconds, a minute. See if somebody wants to ask a question, and if not, we're gonna move on. And again, at the very end, you have another opportunity to ask questions if you want to. Okay, I don't see anything. All right, so let's move on. So the next subsection under this umbrella section of project area description, plans for revitalization, is basically strategy for leveraging resources. Next slide. So leveraging, I mean, just in case, definition, leveraging is the use of existing resources or funding to attract additional resources or funding. So basically money begets money, right? Once you have the first pot of money, it's a much easier task to get the second and the third and the fourth pot of money for a project. So you have this domino effect. If you have some money already, obviously it documents that you committed to the project, especially if it's your own money. And it heightens the confidence in project success, which funders want to see. Now, keep in mind, EPA grant funding is seed funding. It's very, very rare that you will be able to do a project from start to finish using an EPA grant. Usually what you need to do, you need to stitch together various funding sources. Think of it like a big quilt, right? You have all these different pieces that need to fit together. And that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit. Next slide, please. So first off, what do the guidelines say? All right, so this is the language from the assessment and the multi-purpose grants. They're more or less identical, except for one word, and I will point that out. So first off, you are asked to identify the resources that you need for site reuse. So you need to describe your access to monetary funding, from other resources, and how the grant will stimulate the availability of additional funds for site assessments, remediation, and don't forget that, and subsequent reuse. You need to address that in this section. Basically, what it asks you, what are you eligible for? What can you access? So you need to identify your potential key funding sources for assessment and multipurpose. You do not have to have firm commitments. It helps, but you don't need to have any documentation that you need to attach to the grant, like for the cleanup grants that say, okay, we will give you this much money for this particular aspect of the project. So evaluation criteria, you will be evaluated on the extent to which you have access to other sources of funding to make your project work. And the extent to which the potential key funding resources can actually support the completion of the assessment, remediation, and or reuse strategy at the priority site. So your funding really needs to fit with what you want to do. I mean, I have seen applications where you read that and then you scratch your head and you wonder, how is this going to work? And then you think, where did they come up with that? So really make sure that you identify the funding to get specific tasks done here. Next slide, please. So for the cleanup grant, it looks a little bit differently. So basically you have 3 parts, and on this slide there are 2. EPA wants to know the resources that you can access that are needed for site characterization. So if you need to characterize your site more, meaning there need to be additional site assessments done to really know where is the contamination, where could it potentially go, what do you have, how much do you have, then you need to kind of address this. It could be you don't need that, in which case you just say this is not applicable for our grant. And you will be evaluated on how relevant and potentially sufficient these additional funding sources that you mentioned will be to characterize the site for the remediation to be completed. Secondly, you need to identify resources needed for site remediation. Now, this is the one where you are asked to have secured already some resources for that. So it says for resources that have been secured, have been sought, or will be sought. Additionally, discuss if the extent to which the EPA funding discussed in this application is enough to complete the remediation. Usually it's not. So evaluation is the relevancy and degree of these secured funding resources, the degree to which the attached documentation substantiates secured commitments discussed in the narrative part. And the response may only earn full points when the applicant has resources that are secured, significant, relevant, and sufficient to complete the remediation. So if you do not have secured funding resources for site remediation, you will not get full points. You may not have any. You may have sought some, or you're in the process, or you will. I mean, this is the least strong statement here that I will maybe think about these resources and seek them out. I mean, you want to be, at best, you have secured them, but you definitely want to be here. Next slide, please. So the third leg here is the resources needed for site reuse. So again, resources that have been sought, secured, or will be sought to complete the reuse of your site. So that could entail demolition activities, redevelopment activities, whatever you need there for your proposed site. And again, here the eval is pretty much the same. The degree to which secured funding resources will contribute to the completion of the reuse of the proposed brownfield sites. Documentation substantiates the secured commitments. And again, you will not get full points very likely if you have not secured at least some reuse for the cleanup. Next slide. All right, so with anything related to EPA Brownfields grants, timing and prep is everything. I mean, start early. The very fact that you're on this webinar, that's great, right? But I mean, you probably sort of started already thinking about what do you need and tackled some of these things. What you need for any type of funding, additional funding, and for the grant itself too, is a vision. So you need to know what you want to do. You need to have a good team. Don't go it alone because it's a lot and you will likely burn out along the process. And form grant-specific partnerships early, and that includes potential funding sources. Next slide, please. So how do you attract additional resources for funding resources, basically? Again, I said already, the vision needs to be there. You need to have a strong project team. A lot of funders, and this definitely includes EPA, want to see community support, community engagement. The community needs to be behind your project, and you need to be able to document that. You need to know what you need. You need to know How much money do I need for what task? What do I ask a funder for? So it's the less vague, the better. Otherwise, you probably won't see anything, no funding. Know the missions for potentials of potential funders that you will ask for funding. So really read their websites, see what they cater to as far as not grantees necessarily, but who do they give money to? What purposes? And see if you can fit that into your project. And think a little bit outside the box. I mean, there may be funders out there that you have not thought about, and aspects of your project that you have not thought about sticking some money to that you potentially could get. Next slide, please. Vision and priorities. I mean, you need to know what the issue is. I mean, why are you doing this whole thing, right? Why are you asking EPA for money? Why are you tackling this project? Why is this project so important to the community? What will be the end result? I mean, what is the end game? How will you get there? So you need to have a plan. Who will benefit and why? And that's very important for the project. And what is the expected time frame? If I'm asking a funder for some money, I mean, some have time frames which they will, for example, give out grants, but some have not. Some it's flexible. So really, it's the why, the what, the why, the how, and the who. What's the project? Why is it important? How will you accomplish it? And who will benefit in the end when everything is said and done? Next slide. Project team, I already mentioned that. If you are not the local government, a local government representative, or the local government applying for this grant, involve your local leadership early on, especially if you want money from them, because budgets are set early. And once a community budget is set, it's very, very difficult to shake some money loose off of this and you know, mix it into different pots. So the earlier you talk to them, the better. So they know what's coming up. Diversity of local partners. You want to involve key local organizations and stakeholders in your project team. If you're working on a regional basis, replace local here with regional. So regional organizations and stakeholders, regional partners. Involvement across all age groups. If I have a project team that has only people like above the age of 50 on it, I have a lot of experience there, but I might miss out on some creative thinking potentially. So that's where like different viewpoints, different aspects come in of thinking and about tackling a project. And the last one goes without saying, you need to have a good team leader who kind of can rope it all together. And that also is something that funders will look at. Who's on your team and why and what can and will they do? Next slide, please. Community support, really briefly, you need to have this for this grant: participatory planning, frequent communication, equitable involvement, and maintain momentum. Once you have community support, don't just let the community drop like a hot potato, right? I mean, just kind of keep at it, and whatever stage you are, communicate and celebrate small successes. Tell them when you applied for the grant, tell them when you hear something, you know, all this kind of stuff. You want to keep them involved because they can be a big asset. Not every funder looks for community support, but a lot of them do. Next slide, please. You need to know the costs. So that means you need to know your project. You need to know all the project components and how much money do you need for what aspect of the project. Get estimates, and really estimates is really early on as you can. And estimates is all you need. You don't need to have firm figures at this point in time. I mean, you want realistic estimates, right? Remember that from the time you apply for this particular grant until you actually will see the money, that could be a year. Prices go up. So build contingencies in there. Also build contingencies into what you ask other funders for. So where are the gaps and who can fill it? And that's a lot of research that needs to go into this. Next slide, please. Sometimes it helps a lot to establish a resource roadmap, and TAB can help you with that. A research roadmap can be project specific or task specific. I mean, sometimes you have resources that you want to bring to bear that benefit the entire project, all aspects of the project, but sometimes they are very specific to a certain task. So resources can be financial, they can be grants or loans, stuff like that. They can be in form of tech assistance, they can be staff time. Don't forget volunteer hours. A lot of projects have some aspect of volunteer labor associated with it. I'm thinking of one that I was involved with in Texas, where they wanted to use the site as a temporary use for a community garden. And they used the local garden groups, they used the master gardeners, all on a volunteer basis. And they asked them for how many hours they thought this might be to establish the garden, to maintain it. And there were several thousands of dollars coming together that they were able to list as a resource, as an additional resource, additional funding in their grant application. And there's a website I put here where you can get the current volunteer hours as a monetary value. So resource roadmaps can be pretty helpful, just kind of keeping everything in line and together. Next slide, please. So here are some of the funding resources for leveraging. This is by no stretch of the imagination a complete list. But if you need to have additional site assessments, the TBAs, the targeted brownfields assessments, I mean, you could ask your state, you could ask EPA, you can list them. You can have TAB as a resource. When we do visioning sessions or market analyses for communities, we can put a price tag to that. So you can list that as a monetary resource. Private sector, the developers, I mean, they can tell you how much they spend on what, and that can be used as sort of collateral. Banks, traditional lenders, regional planning agencies, economic development districts or agencies, all of these can contribute something to a project, very likely that you can use in your additional resources page right up. Local incentives, tax incentives, TIF, tax increment funding. Most local governments have access to general obligation bonds. You can use those. Other local incentives could, for example, be help with infrastructure. Don't forget foundations, like the philanthropic aspect. There are community foundations, there are regional, there are corporate foundations. So that's a little bit thinking outside the box here. And then, of course, you have other federal resources. If you're a small rural community, USDA, you have DOT, you have HUD, like CDBG funding for housing, also for demolition. I mean, USDA and HUD under CDBG are the only federal agencies that I'm aware of that have grants for demolition for certain projects. US Fish and Wildlife, Corps of Engineer, if you have anything that's going to take place along a waterway, right? EDA. National Endowments for the Art, and on and on and on. What I want to reiterate here too is, like, again, the local government funds start planning for this very, very early in the process. Local governments don't like to be surprised by some asks to, change their budget and give out money that they were not planning on. Next slide, please. This is a little bit resourcey, not quite though, but I mean, the other aspect of this subsection is the use of existing infrastructure that you need to answer. So I just have one slide on this. So you have the language in the RFP, what is required. So you describe how work performed under this grant will facilitate the use of existing infrastructure, because we are revitalizing, we're reusing a site, meaning something ought to be there already, right? And then if you need additional infrastructure needs or upgrades, like, for example, you want to refurbish a sidewalk or gutters, or a street needs to be realigned, or you need to, because you anticipate more traffic, you need to resurface it. This all can go into this. And then you need to describe like how you will fund this. And here on this side, you see how you will be evaluated, how your response be evaluated. Clear description of the infrastructure needs and upgrades, identify funding resources that will be sought, so you don't need to have firm commitments. And of course, everything needs to be relevant to the project. So infrastructure includes obviously buildings, roads, power supplies, transportation lines. I mean, that's a wide field here. So again, look at previously successful grants that might help you a little bit with what's needed here in case you don't know or are at a loss. Next slide, please. All right, and my favorite image here. Start early. Anything to do with EPA Brownfields grants, the earlier the better, and definitely funding sources, because it will take time. In order to get money, you need to be able to tell a funder what you need and why and what for. And that, putting that packet together, that might take some time. Next slide. And that's that. All right. Questions and wrap up. Yay. Feels like a marathon here. Any questions in the chat? I see one regarding funding sources that were used for projects. That was already on the slide that I had from my perspective, but for everybody else that is participating here as an attendee, maybe you can put in the chat what you used for projects, if you had previous projects. And of course, if you have any other questions relating to anything you heard in this webinar so far, just put it in the chat. I don't see anything. Okay, let's do the next slide. You can still put questions in the chat, but while you're doing that, I just want to remind you of the survey that Tab always does for these webinars. You can, it's a very brief survey. It's not going to take you a long time, maybe a minute or two. So scan the QR code or use the evaluation link that can be found in the chat. Dana just put it in, or you have it right here on the slide. And just kind of tell us what you thought. It will help us kind of, you know, with subsequent webinars in general that we do, and also with webinars in this series here. I'm going to let this stand for a little bit here. I know everybody likes to do surveys so very much, but this one is a good one. It's short. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I need to see what this is, because since this just got, I'm just subbing here. Let's see, these are the previous two bullets here, are the previous two webinars in the past that were done in this series. And these were obviously also recorded, and those recorders should be up on the Tab website. Now this was ours here, I believe. So that will be recorded. We had a little bit of EJ in there. And you can see what's coming up here. So there will be 5 webinars total in this series. All of them are listed on the website where you registered. What questions should you answer now for your grant application? And I mean, please, everybody else who was a speaker, you can chime in here. I think you need to identify your project. You need to get community support. Visioning is great. Do it now. If you need additional funding, definitely put your feelers out. Yeah, Maggie put in the grant, start with a great project, not a great grant. Yep. I always say that. Yeah, there are a lot of communities out there who just kind of scour grants and say, oh, that's a good one, you know, $2 million. What can I possibly do with this? What project do I have that might fit the bill? That never ends well. I mean, really have a good project and don't go the route looking at the money first and then kind of identifying a project that might be a good fit. But really the prep work, align your partners, talk to people, get to know your community if you don't yet. Talk to site owners. Are they willing to participate or not? Some may need some persuading. You need to be able to tell them the benefits of all this. What is in it for them, right? What's in it for the community? That kind of stuff. So that's what I think you can do now. Next slide, please. See what else we have on the slide deck. Oh, okay. Contact information for all the speakers that were speaking here. And I want to thank everybody. Obviously, Jan was not unfortunately. But you have everything here. And again, the slide deck will be in on the website where you registered, along with a recording of the webinar.
We did have a question come in, Sabina.
Oh, where is it?
Let's see. It says, similar to the example at the beginning, they represent a multi-county area. Is it best to do an overall ask for the entire region or divide into multiple grant requests and or subregions?
Multiple grant requests. I'm kind of stuck on that. What do you mean by that? I mean, obviously you're going to go for one grant and you are asking the communities then what, different things? If you could clarify that a little bit, or Maggie, do you know how to interpret that differently?
Yeah, Matt, if you want to unmute and ask that question,
Yeah.
because we're a small group, that would be great. I interpret it as, would they apply for one large grant to divvy up, or they apply for multiple grants that they could administer in the different regions?
Yeah, so we represent 13 counties in southern Colorado, going from the rural kind of plains to the more mountainous areas here in southern Colorado. So there's different needs throughout this large area. So would you look over the entire area? Again, the 13 counties, I think they said there was 10 or so in that example at the beginning, or kind of do sub-regions more specified to, these 3 counties, and looking at that would be my question.
Well, it depends on your capacity to write and to administer, I think. I mean, that's the very end game, right? I mean, do you have the administrative capability to write like 3 or 4 grants, depending if you wanted to really segment it up? What I would do, not knowing your region, I would see, okay, where are the similarities? And are there similarities across the region? If you, and I'm thinking like geographic area, you might want to do your entire region of the 13 counties, and then specify target areas that you're actually going to be focusing on in the grant.
Thank you.
I mean, to me right now, not knowing anything about your region and about your communities, that might make more sense, because then you have the flexibility. But this is something that we can potentially help you sort out, because Maggie, Colorado, that's in your area of assistance providership.
Yeah, we could set up a call and have a discussion about that, because I agree with you, Sabina. I think it just depends a little bit on the needs of the different communities or areas. Are they more in line? Are they different? How many sites does each community have? Would it benefit? What is the capacity? Can you manage 1 grant, let alone 2 or 3 grants? Just think about all those things. And I'm happy to, I can put my contact in the chat, but I'm happy to have a discussion about that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions? Dana just put in the chat here, not to forget about next Thursday. That's the next webinar, number 4, about community need and community engagement. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I think I want to ask. Oh, that's Maggie's. All right, contact information. Thank you to all the presenters. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I bumbled through some of this. I wasn't really that well prepared. I just found out, and Jen didn't know, of course, that, you know, she had this family emergency, but I hope you nevertheless that you got a lot of information out of this webinar. Don't hesitate to contact any of us if you have specific questions. Contact Jen. I mean, she is the Region 7 tab regional manager. So if you're in Region 7, obviously we can answer all of the questions, hopefully, that you have. And then if you're in different tab regions, we can refer you to the other tab managers for the different tabs. So the upshot is we hope that we can help you. All right, well, thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody who attended and patiently sat through this hour and a half. Really 2.5 hours, actually. And I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.